Okay, so today we're going deep on cryonics.
All right.
Um, and, just for everyone listening, this is the idea of preserving
Yeah.
human remains, bodies, or brains, or whatever, at super low temperatures,
Right.
with the hope that, I don't know, someday in the future,
Yeah.
there might be a way to revive them,
Revive them. Yeah. Bring them back.
bring them back.
It's definitely a pretty out there concept.
It is. It is. And I think, when we've talked about this before off the air,
Right.
it almost feels like science fiction.
It does. Yeah. I mean, the term itself comes from the Greek word krios, which just means cold.
Well,
And
of
that
course
really
it-
gets to the heart of what it is. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely something that most scientists kind of look at and go, I don't know about that.
Yeah, you hear everything from pseudoscience to, quackery,
Mhm.
people drawing parallels to snake oil and that kind of thing.
Sure.
But there are people who are really, really serious about this.
Oh, yeah, there are actual companies and facilities, and this is something people are doing and spending money on.
They are, and we've all seen it in movies and stuff, right?
Right.
This idea of suspended animation. You can freeze someone, and then however many years later,
Right.
wake them up, good as new, and it's like, no big deal.
Yeah, it's a very common sci-fi trope.
Exactly, exactly. But that's what we're going to dive into today.
Okay.
How much of that is really rooted in science?
Right.
What are the actual steps involved? What are the huge hurdles that exist? And how does society view this?
Yeah, all good questions.
Yeah. And we've gone through a lot of research on this. So the goal here is to really give you the key information, try to satisfy some of that curiosity that I think a lot of us have
Sure.
without getting too bogged down into all the, hyper-technical
Mm-mm.
scientific stuff.
All right.
So let's start with just the idea behind it. Like, why do people believe that this could actually work?
Okay, so the main argument that you hear from cryonicists is that even after, someone is legally dead, when their brain activity has basically stopped or it's really messed up,
Yeah.
they think the structure of the brain itself, the way the neurons are connected, that holds the information, the memories, the personality.
Okay.
And if you can preserve that structure, then maybe sometime in the future, there might be a way to recover that information.
Interesting. So they're not saying that, like if someone's brain is not active,
Right.
there's still like, some kind of consciousness happening.
No, they're acknowledging that like the brain activity we have now is important.
Oh.
But they're saying the memories, who you are, that's somehow embedded in the actual physical connections.
Okay. And as long as those connections are there, it's almost like, you've got a computer.
Right.
The hard drive's still there,
Okay.
even if the computer's not turned on.
Yeah, like the data is still there.
Data is still there.
Yeah.
So they're saying if we can just preserve that structure, then maybe someday there's a way to access that data again.
Right. And they're not talking about regular freezing here. It has to be way, way colder, like below negative 130 degrees Celsius.
Wow, that is cold.
Yeah, that's called cryopreservation.
Cryopreservation. Okay, so how do they actually do that?
So there are two main ways. One is to use basically freezing,
Okay.
but they also use these things called cryoprotectants.
What are those?
They're special chemicals that help prevent ice crystals from forming.
Oh.
Because
that's-
ice crystals can really damage cells. You can think of them like, tiny little knives going through the cells.
Oh, I see.
So these cryoprotectants, they kind of get in there and stop that from happening as much.
Interesting.
The second way is even more, I guess you could say, advanced,
All right.
and it's called vitrification.
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 Mhm.
And that uses a lot, and I mean a lot of cryoprotectants.
Clear.
To the point where the tissue doesn't actually freeze, it turns into something like glass.
Oh, wow.
So you're completely bypassing the ice crystal formation.
So it's not like frozen solid. It's more like
Solid, but it's more like a glass.
a glass.
Yeah.
So even with all of that, are they able to perfectly preserve a body or a brain?
So that's the big thing. Even with the best technology we have now, the cryopreservation process still causes damage.
I see.
And a lot of this damage happens because when you're trying to get those cryoprotectants into the cells,
Right.
you end up drawing water out of the cells.
All right.
That's called dehydration. And that can be a problem.
Okay.
And then the cryoprotectants themselves, even though they prevent ice crystals, they can be toxic in high concentrations.
So it's like you're trying to protect the cells, but the protector itself can also cause some harm.
Exactly. Yeah. It's kind of a trade-off.
It's a balancing act.
And the thing is, with what we know now, we can't reverse that damage.
So even if, let's say, revival was possible in the future,
Right.
they wouldn't just be like waking up as if they just fell asleep.
No, no, there's going to be some damage that needs to be repaired.
And they call the people who undergo this process patients,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, they do. And that really reflects their belief that someday future technology will be able to fix the damage and even reverse the thing that caused them to die in the first place.
So it's all riding on this hope that future tech, like
Hmm.
nanotechnology, will come in and save the day.
Yeah, nanotechnology is a big one you hear about.
Yeah, nanotech, that's like manipulating stuff at the atomic level, right?
Right, super tiny robots that can go in and fix things at a really small scale.
Wow. It almost sounds like that, mind uploading thing where they're talking about,
Mm-hmm.
you know, transferring consciousness to a computer or something.
Yeah, mind uploading. It's definitely a related idea. It's not exactly the same as physically bringing someone back,
Right.
but it's another way that people are thinking about, maybe achieving some kind of digital immortality.
Right, right. Interesting.
Yeah.
So, okay, let's talk about the practical side of cryonics. Like, how much does all of this cost? I have a feeling it's not cheap.
You are right about that. It is not cheap. I mean, think about it. You've got this whole team of people who have to be ready to go at a moment's notice.
Oh, right.
Because as soon as someone is declared legally dead, they want to start the preservation process as quickly as possible.
So they've got like a standby team ready to go.
Yeah, and that alone is going to cost a lot. And then there's the vitrification process itself.
Right.
Those cryoprotectants, they're not cheap.
Okay.
And then you've got to transport the body, usually in dry ice, to a facility that can store it long-term.
Long-term storage. Okay.
And a big chunk of the cost is actually for that long-term storage. They keep the bodies or brains in liquid nitrogen, which is super cold, and that takes a lot of energy and maintenance.
So it's not like a one-time fee.
No, not at all. It's more like you're paying into a trust fund that's supposed to cover the storage for, well, potentially forever.
Forever. Wow.
Yeah.
So as of, I think, 2018, the costs ranged from like US $28,000
Yeah.
to a whopping $200,000. That's a huge range.
It is a big range, and a lot of it depends on the level of service you choose.
Okay.
Some places offer more personalized care, individual storage, things like that.
Makes sense. And you mentioned vitrification being the preferred method. Can you explain a little more about why that is?
So remember how I said those ice crystals can be really damaging to cells?
Yeah, like tiny little knives.
Exactly. Well, vitrification basically bypasses that whole problem because you're not actually freezing.
Okay.
It's like if you could take water and turn it straight into glass without going through the ice phase.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And there were these two cryobiologists, Gregory Fahey and Brian Walk.
Okay.
Back in the late 90s, they did a lot of work to develop cryoprotectant solutions that could vitrify whole organs.
Wow, whole organs?
Yeah, they were actually trying to improve organ preservation for transplants.
That makes sense.
But they also did experiments where they vitrified animal brains.
Okay.
And when they looked at them under a microscope after they thawed them, they didn't see any ice crystal damage.
So the vitrification worked.
It did, yeah. But remember, they still had those other problems, the dehydration and the toxicity of the cryoprotectants themselves.
Right, right. A balancing act.
Exactly. They were able to get rid of the ice damage, but these other types of damage, they were still there.
I see. So how do people usually pay for all of this? It's a lot of money.
So in the U.S., a lot of people use life insurance.
Oh, okay.
They take out a policy and they name the Cryonics organization as the beneficiary.
So that when they die, the money goes straight to the cryonics company.
Right. That way, the money's there to cover everything. The procedure, the transportation, the long-term storage.
That's smart. Planning ahead.
Yeah. And it's not just in the U.S. either. There are facilities in other countries as well.
Oh.
There's this company in Russia called Cryonics, and their prices are actually a lot lower.
How much lower are we talking?
Like $12,000 to $36,000.
That's significantly less.
Yeah, it's a big difference. And part of the reason is that they use communal storage. So instead of each person getting their own individual unit,
Okay.
they store multiple people in these big tanks called douars.
It makes sense.
And another thing that can affect the cost is whether you choose whole body cryopreservation or just neuropreservation.
Neuropreservation, so that's just the brain.
Yeah, just the brain. And that's usually cheaper.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
And it really shows what they're focusing on, right?
Right. They're really betting on the idea that the essence of a person is in their brain.
Right, right. So how many people have actually done this so far?
It's hard to get exact numbers, but back in 2014, it was estimated that around 250 people had been cryopreserved in the US,
Uh-huh.
and about 1,500 people had made arrangements for it.
Wow.
So there are definitely people out there who are serious about this.
Yeah, yeah. And as of 2016, there were 4 main facilities, 3 in the US and 1 in Russia.
Right. But there are new ones popping up. There's this company called Tomorrow Biostasis. They started in Berlin in 2019, and they built a facility in Switzerland, which just opened in 2022.
So it's growing.
Yeah, it's definitely gaining some traction.
But here's the thing. This whole thing relies on these companies being around for potentially hundreds of years, right?
Yeah, that's a big unknown.
And we know that companies fail, even big successful companies. I mean, look at all the companies that existed 100 years ago that are gone now.
Right. And in the cryonics world, that's actually a big problem. It's
Right.
happened a lot. Before 1973, pretty much all of the cryonics companies that existed, they went out of business.
Wow.
And the sad part is, a lot of the people who were cryopreserved by those companies, they ended up being thawed and disposed of.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it's a really tragic situation. And it highlights how risky this whole thing is. You're basically putting your faith in these companies
Right.
and hoping that they're going to be around for centuries to take care of you.
And that they're going to manage their money well and
Ex-
all sorts of things.
Yeah, it's a big gamble.
Huge gamble. Okay, so let's talk about some of the, I guess you could call them obstacles
Mm-hmm.
to this whole thing actually working. And I think the first one, the most obvious one,
Yeah.
is that even if you can preserve a body or a brain, we don't currently have the technology to revive someone from that state, right?
That's right. I mean, think about it. In labs, they can freeze individual cells, embryos, even small pieces of tissue
Okay.
and bring them back. But when you're talking about a whole organ, let alone a whole person, that's a completely different story.
Yeah.
We just don't know how to do that yet.
And why is that? What's so difficult about it?
Well, one big problem is that when you're freezing something large, like a body or a brain,
Yeah.
it's really hard to cool it down evenly.
Oh.
And that can cause fractures,
Mhm.
especially if you're doing vitrification, because the tissue gets really brittle.
Like glass.
Yeah, like glass. And the bigger the thing you're trying to freeze, the harder it is to avoid those fractures.
I see. And then even if you could somehow prevent those fractures,
Yeah.
what about the damage that happens at the cellular level?
Right. So even if you could somehow get the cryoprotectants into every single cell perfectly,
Mhm.
there are still problems. Like when you're freezing something, the water inside the cells can start to form ice crystals.
Right.
And those ice crystals, they can pierce the cell membranes, they can damage the organelles inside the cells. It's just a mess.
And that's what the cryoprotectants are supposed to prevent.
Yeah, they're supposed to,
Okay.
but they don't always work perfectly.
Right.
And even if they did, you still have the problem of dehydration.
Right, right. You mentioned that before.
When you're putting the cryoprotectants in, you're pulling water out,
Yeah.
and that can damage the cells too. And then there's the toxicity of the cryoprotectants themselves.
It's that balancing act again.
It is. You're trying to protect the cells from one thing, but you might be damaging them with another.
Right, right. It sounds like there's some cryonics organizations that are trying to address this by prioritizing different aspects of preservation.
Yeah, that's true. Some of them are really focused on preserving the molecules as perfectly as possible, even if it means sacrificing some of the overall structure.
So they're thinking, like, if we can preserve the information at the molecular level,
Mm-hmm.
maybe future technology can fix the structural stuff.
Exactly. But not everyone agrees with that approach. Some scientists, like João Pedro Magalhães,
Okay.
he's a researcher who studies aging. He says that using those really strong chemicals to fix the molecules, it might actually make revival impossible.
Oh, how so?
Well, those chemicals, they can be really toxic.
Okay.
And he's concerned that they might be damaging the very structures that they're trying to preserve.
I see.
So it's like you're trying to preserve something for the future, but the way you're doing it might make it unusable.
It's a bit of a paradox, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And you have to remember, all of this is happening against a backdrop of pretty significant skepticism from the scientific community.
Right. Most scientists are not on board with this.
No, they're not. Like, there's this cryobiologist, Dae Young Gao, And he's pointed out that we don't even know if the people who are being vitrified are actually being damaged to the point where they can't be revived.
Oh, okay.
Because they're
Right.
frozen, we can't really examine them.
Right, right.
So we're kind of operating in the dark here.
And there was that other scientist you mentioned.
Ken Story.
Yeah, Ken Story.
Yeah, he's a biochemist, and he brings up the fact that the brain is incredibly complex.
Hmm.
Like, different parts of the brain have different types of cells,
Okay.
and they might need to be cryopreserved in different ways.
Oh, that's interesting.
But right now, the way cryonics is done, it's pretty much a one-size-fits-all approach.
I see. So even if they could overcome the problems with preserving the brain,
Right.
the actual revival process would be incredibly complex.
It would be mind-blowingly complex. I mean, first of all, you'd have to repair all the damage from the cryopreservation itself,
Okay.
the dehydration, the toxicity, any fractures that might have happened,
Right.
and then you'd have to deal with the damage that happened when the person died in the first place.
Oh, right. Like whatever caused their death.
Yeah, you might be talking about massive organ failure, brain damage, all sorts of things.
And we're not even close to being able to fix that kind of damage, are we?
No, not even close. We're just starting to understand things like tissue regeneration.
Yeah.
But to bring someone back from the dead after they've been cryopreserved for who knows how long, it's science fiction at this point.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so beyond all the scientific challenges,
Mm-hmm.
there are also some pretty big legal and ethical questions around all of this, right?
Absolutely. Like, what is the legal status of a cryopreserved body?
Right, that's a good question.
Is it a person? Is it property?
And if it's a person, are they dead or alive?
Yeah, it's a gray area. And
Yeah.
the laws vary from country to country. Okay. But in most places, they basically treat cryopreserved bodies as deceased.
Which makes sense because they have to be legally dead before they can start the procedure, right?
Right, exactly. But that creates all sorts of other issues. Like in France, cryonics isn't even considered a legal way to dispose of a body.
Interesting.
And in British Columbia, they've actually banned the sale of cryonics arrangements.
Wow, so it's actually illegal there.
Yeah. But then you have places like Russia, where it's kind of a legal free-for-all.
What do you mean?
Well, cryonics in Russia doesn't really fall under any specific regulations. It's not considered a medical procedure, and it's not considered part of the funeral industry.
So it's just like this weird loophole.
Exactly. And it makes things a lot easier for cryonics companies operating there.
I see. Have there been any court cases that have addressed this, like, legal limbo around cryonics?
Yeah, actually, there have been a few interesting ones. In 2016, in England, there was this case where a teenage girl who is terminally ill wanted to be cryopreserved,
Okay.
but her father didn't want her to.
Oh, wow.
And the court actually ruled in favor of the girl.
Really?
Yeah, they said that it was her body and she had the right to choose what happened to it.
Interesting.
But the judge in that case also said that the government really needed to come up with some clear regulations around cryonics.
That makes sense. It's such a new and unusual thing.
Yeah, it is.
So there aren't really any laws that specifically address it.
Right. And then there was another case in the U.S., in Iowa,
Okay.
where this guy wanted to be cryopreserved, but his family buried him instead.
Oh, no.
And the court actually ordered that his body be exhumed and sent to a cryonics facility.
Wow, that's pretty extreme.
It is, yeah, but it shows how seriously the courts are taking this issue of people's wishes regarding their own bodies.
Right, right. So even if it's not legally recognized as a form of burial or anything,
Mm-hmm.
the courts are still upholding people's right to choose it.
They are. And then more recently, there was a legal examination in Germany,
Okay.
and they concluded that long-term cryogenic storage is actually legal there.
So it's becoming more accepted.
Yeah, slowly but surely, the legal landscape is starting to shift.
Okay, so let's move on to the ethical side of things. Because even if it becomes legally permissible everywhere,
Right.
there are still a lot of ethical questions to grapple with.
Absolutely. Like, is it even ethical to try to cheat death in this way?
Right.
And what about the huge costs involved? Is it fair that only wealthy people would potentially have access to this technology?
Yeah, that's a big one.
And then there's the whole issue of false hope.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we don't even know if revival is possible, so are we just giving people false hope by selling them on this idea?
And are we encouraging people to, maybe end their lives prematurely?
Yeah,
Because they think they can just be revived later.
that's a real concern. And then there's the risk that something could go wrong.
Right.
Like, what if there is a natural disaster or a war or something that destroys the cryonics facility?
Yeah, what happens to all those people who are frozen there?
Exactly. It's a lot of responsibility.
Yeah. Huge responsibility.
Hmm.
But there are also people who make ethical arguments in favor of cryonics, right?
There are, yeah. Like, some people argue that if we could bring people back from the dead, it would be a huge benefit to society.
Okay.
I mean, imagine all the knowledge and experience that we could gain from people who lived in the past.
Right. They could teach us so much.
Yeah. And some people see cryonics as a way to achieve a kind of immortality,
Okay.
which, has been a human dream for as long as we've been around.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it all comes down to that basic human desire to not die, right?
Right. I mean, who wouldn't want to live longer if they could?
Yeah, it's a powerful instinct.
Hmm.
And there's also the argument that if someone really believes in cryonics and it gives them comfort, who are we to say that they can't do it?
Right. It's about respecting people's autonomy and their wishes.
Yeah, yeah. And I know that there was this philosopher,
David Shaw?
yeah, David Shaw, who actually used Pascal's wager to argue in favor of cryonics.
Oh, yeah. That's an interesting one.
Can you remind me what Pascal's wager is again?
So basically, it's this idea that even if you don't know for sure if God exists,
Okay.
it's better to believe in God just in case.
Just in case you're wrong.
Yeah, because if you're right, you go to heaven. But if you're wrong and you don't believe, then you might go to hell.
Right, right. So it's like better safe than sorry.
Exactly. And David Shaw, he applied that same logic to cryonics.
So he's saying even if you don't know for sure if revival is possible,
Right.
it's better to sign up for cryonics just in case.
Yeah, because if you're right, you get to live again. But if you're wrong and you don't sign up, then you're definitely dead.
I see, I see. It's a pretty compelling argument, actually.
It is, yeah. It makes you think.
It does, it does. Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about the history of cryonics. When did this whole idea first come about?
Well, the idea of freezing things to preserve them has been around for a long time.
Okay.
But the first time anyone actually froze human cells and brought them back to life was in 1954.
Wow, that's a while ago.
Yeah, it was. They froze human sperm and used it for artificial insemination.
Oh, wow.
And it worked.
So that was kind of a proof of concept that human cells could be frozen and revived.
Yeah, in a way it was.
But when did people start talking about freezing whole bodies?
Well, that really started with this guy named Robert Edinger.
Okay.
He was a physicist, and in 1962, he published a book called The Prospect of Immortality.
That's a bold title.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
And in that book, he basically laid out the whole idea of cryonics, freezing people and then reviving them sometime in the future.
So he's considered like the father of cryonics.
Yeah, pretty much.
And when was the first time someone actually tried to cryopreserve a human body?
Well, there was an attempt in 1966, but it wasn't very successful.
Oh, what happened?
Well, the body had already been embalmed, which we now know is a bad idea,
Okay,
and the freezing process wasn't very sophisticated.
I see.
So a few days later, the body was thawed and buried.
So it wasn't a true cryopreservation attempt in the sense that they weren't really hoping to revive the person?
Right, it was more of an experiment.
Okay, so when was the first real attempt with the intention of eventual revival?
That was in 1967 with a guy named James Bedford.
James Bedford, okay.
He was a psychology professor who had cancer,
Oh, okay.
and he wanted to be cryopreserved after he died.
And they actually went through with it?
They did, yeah. They used a primitive cryoprotectant solution and froze his body in liquid nitrogen.
Wow. And is he still frozen today?
He is. He's the only person who was cryopreserved before 1974 who's still being preserved.
Wow, that's amazing.
It is. And Robert Edinger himself, the guy who wrote The Prospect of Immortality,
Right.
he died in 2011 and he was cryopreserved too.
So he really believed in his own ideas.
He did, yeah. But the early years of cryonics were definitely a bit of a Wild West.
What do you mean?
Well, there were a lot of problems. Like,
Yeah.
there was this company called the Cryonics Society of California, and they were really mismanaged.
Okay.
They didn't have enough money, and they didn't really know what they were doing.
Right.
And it ended up really badly. 9 bodies that were supposed to be preserved, they ended up thawing and decomposing.
Oh, that's horrible.
It was a huge scandal, and it really hurt the reputation of the cryonics movement.
Yeah, I can
People
imagine.
started to see it as a scam or just a bunch of crazy people.
Makes sense. And I know that there have been some more recent developments like that company that was trying to preserve brains using chemicals.
Oh, you mean Nectome?
Yeah, Nectome.
Yeah, they were pretty controversial.
How so?
Well, their method involved using these really powerful chemicals to preserve the structure of the brain.
Okay.
But the catch was the chemicals were lethal.
So the people who signed up for this had to be euthanized.
Yeah, they did. It was a really ethically fraught situation.
Yeah, I can see why that would be controversial.
And they weren't even promising to revive the people in the traditional sense.
Oh, okay.
Their goal was to create a super detailed map of the brain's
Oh, I
connections.
see.
And then someday, maybe upload that map to a computer.
So kind of digital immortality.
Yeah, something like that.
Fascinating, but also pretty creepy, I have to say.
Yeah, it's definitely on the fringe of the fringe.
So who are the people who are drawn to cryonics? Are there any common traits?
Well, historically, it's been mostly non-religious white men.
Okay.
Like, the ratio was something like 3 men for every woman.
Wow, that's a pretty big gender gap.
It is, yeah. But it seems like things might be changing a little bit.
How so?
Well, more recently, there's been an increase in the number of whole families signing up for cryonics.
Oh, interesting.
So it's not just individuals anymore.
Right, right. And has cryonics spread beyond the U.S. and Russia?
It has, yeah. There's that company in Europe now, Tomorrow Biostasis.
Right. Yeah.
And in 2015, there was this Chinese woman, Du Hong. She was a science fiction writer.
Yeah.
And she had her head cryopreserved.
So it's starting to become more global.
Yeah, it seems like it, but it's still a pretty niche thing.
Yeah, definitely. So what about the overall